Hey everyone, tonight we descend into the shadowed corners of ancient Rome, not to witness the glory of its conquests or the grandeur of its architecture, but to uncover something far more extraordinary and deeply human. While history remembers Rome for its brutal executions, its theatrical punishments, and its appetite for public death, tonight we explore the other side of that darkness. The remarkable, almost impossible stories of those who looked death in the eye. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments, and somehow against all odds walked away. Picture this. A man hanging from wooden beams under the scorching Mediterranean sun, nails driven through his flesh, crowds jeering below, yet 3 days later he's sharing wine in a tavern, scarred but breathing. Imagine a woman thrown to starving lions in the Colosseum's sand, only to emerge months later, mauled but alive, her survival becoming legend whispered through the empire's furthest provinces. Think of slaves who endured the breaking wheel, who felt their bones shatter like kindling, yet somehow crawled from their execution sites to live another decade. These aren't myths or religious miracles. These are documented accounts, recorded in Roman administrative documents, carved into tombstones, and preserved in the writings of historians who couldn't quite believe what they'd witnessed. Tonight we're diving deep into the most forbidden topic in Roman history, how people survived what was designed to be unsurvivable. We'll explore the underground networks of physicians who risked their lives to revive the dead, the corruption that could buy you a reprieve mid-execution, the anatomical quirks that saved some while dooming others, and the sheer bloody-minded human determination that occasionally proved stronger than Rome's machinery of death. We'll meet former gladiators who knew exactly where to take a sword thrust to look fatal while preserving vital organs, prisoners who discovered that certain poisons could mimic death so convincingly that they fooled professional executioners, and condemned Christians who developed elaborate codes to signal their confederates in the crowd. But this isn't just a catalogue of clever escapes and miraculous survivals. Tonight's journey will reveal something deeper about the human spirit, about the lengths people will go to preserve life when death seems certain, and about the cracks in even the most ruthless system of state violence. We'll discover that for every method Rome devised to kill, someone, somewhere, found a way to survive it. The Roman Empire prided itself on the efficiency of its justice system. Crucifixion was designed to be a slow, public, humiliating death that would deter others from rebellion. The arena was meant to be an inescapable theatre of death, where condemned criminals provided entertainment through their dying. Mass executions were orchestrated to demonstrate the absolute power of the state over its subjects. Yet scattered throughout 2 centuries of meticulous Roman record-keeping are accounts that shouldn't exist, death certificates that were later rescinded, execution orders followed by pardons for the already dead, and burial preparations interrupted by the inconvenient resurrection of the supposedly deceased. These survival stories weren't random flukes of biology or divine intervention. They reveal an entire shadow economy built around cheating Rome's death machine. There were doctors who specialized in reviving crucifixion victims, knowing exactly how long the human body could hang before irreversible damage set in. There were arena workers who could be bribed to provide drugged meat to lions, making them sluggish and less likely to deliver fatal wounds. There were executioners who for the right price would ensure that a flogging stopped just short of death, or that a crucifixion nail missed major arteries by crucial inches. More fascinating still were the condemned themselves, who developed an underground knowledge base about survival that was passed from prisoner to prisoner like a secret curriculum. They learned which parts of the body could sustain incredible damage while keeping you alive, how to slow your heartbeat and breathing to mimic death, and most importantly, how to read the crowd and the officials to identify potential allies who might help stage a rescue. Some survival stories are almost too incredible to believe, yet they're documented in multiple sources. There's the account of Marcus Flavius, a former centurion condemned for desertion, who survived not one but 3 separate execution attempts over the course of a month. First crucifixion, revived by sympathetic soldiers after being declared dead. Then the arena, mauled by a bear but rescued by spectators who had bet heavily on his survival. Finally a public burning, escaped when a sudden thunderstorm convinced the superstitious crowd that the gods favored him. Then there's the extraordinary case of the Cappadocian slaves who were condemned to mass crucifixion after a failed uprising. Historical records show that 73 slaves were crucified along the Via Appia, yet within 2 years nearly a dozen of them were documented as living under assumed names in various parts of the empire. They had developed an intricate system of fake deaths, underground medical care, and identity changes that turned their executions into elaborate disappearing acts. But perhaps most remarkable were the survival networks that developed around Rome's Christian communities during the persecutions. These weren't just people praying for miracles. They were organized, sophisticated operations that rivaled anything in the modern world. They had spotters in the crowds who could signal when an execution was going badly, medical teams standing by to revive victims declared dead, and safe houses where survivors could recover while new identities were arranged. Tonight we're going to explore how these networks operated, how they developed their knowledge of human anatomy and the limits of survival, and how they managed to operate for decades under the noses of the world's most efficient police state. We'll discover that some of the most celebrated martyrs in early Christian history were actually elaborate survival operations, and that the miraculous resurrections that converted so many Romans to Christianity were often the result of careful planning and medical knowledge rather than divine intervention. We'll also examine the Roman authorities' awareness of these survival operations and their increasingly desperate attempts to counter them. As word spread that execution wasn't necessarily final, the entire foundation of Roman deterrent justice began to crumble. This led to innovations in execution methods specifically designed to prevent survival, creating a macabre arms race between those trying to die and live to tell about it, and those determined to ensure that death was permanent and public. But beyond the mechanics of survival, these stories reveal something profound about human nature and the will to live. They show us that even in history's most brutal moments, people found ways to hope, to plan, to resist, and to endure. They remind us that behind every statistic of Roman violence was an individual human being who might have been thinking not of martyrdom or glory, but simply of seeing another sunrise. So settle in for a journey into the most hidden corners of Roman history, where death was negotiable, survival was an art form, and the condemned wrote the most extraordinary escape stories ever recorded. Tonight we discover that even in the heart of the empire's darkness, life found a way. To understand how Romans survived the unsurvivable, we must first grasp a fundamental truth that the empire tried desperately to hide. Roman execution was never as efficient as it appeared. Behind the theatrical brutality, behind the crowds baying for blood, behind the carefully orchestrated spectacles of state violence, lay a system riddled with human error, corruption, and most importantly, compassion. The Roman approach to execution was built on a paradox. On one hand, they needed death to be public, dramatic, and memorable, a spectacle that would terrorize potential rebels and criminals into submission. On the other hand, they needed it to be administratively manageable, cost-effective, and staffed by ordinary human beings who had to live with what they did for a living. This tension created countless opportunities for survival that the state could never fully eliminate. Consider the sheer logistics of Roman mass execution. During major persecutions or after large-scale rebellions, hundreds of people might be condemned to death simultaneously. The machinery of Roman justice, efficient as it was, couldn't possibly monitor every nail driven through every wrist, every sword thrust in every arena, every lash of every whip. Executioners were often slaves themselves, men who understood that they might easily be on the receiving end of their own instruments. Guards were typically drawn from the urban cohorts, soldiers who lived in the same neighborhoods as the condemned, who might have grown up with them, drunk with them, even loved them. This human element was the fatal flaw in Rome's death machine. Every execution required dozens of people to participate, from the magistrate who pronounced sentence to the gravedigger who covered the body. At each step, human judgment, human emotion, and human greed created possibilities for survival that no legal code could anticipate or prevent. The Romans understood this vulnerability, which is why execution methods became increasingly elaborate and public over time. Early Roman executions were relatively simple affairs: a sword to the neck, a push off the Tarpeian rock, a quick throttling. But as survival stories began to circulate, as families started bribing officials, as underground networks developed their expertise, the state responded with more complex, more foolproof methods designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. Crucifixion became the preferred method, not because it was more painful than alternatives, but because it was more visible and seemingly more permanent. A man hanging from a cross for days was clearly obviously dead to any observer. The slow process of dying allowed crowds to witness the entirety of the condemned suffering, making the deterrent effect more powerful. Most importantly, the public nature of crucifixion made it harder for accomplices to stage rescues or medical interventions. Yet even crucifixion had its vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities were systematically exploited by those determined to preserve life. The method relied on several assumptions: that the condemned would remain conscious and suffering for an extended period, that blood loss and asphyxiation would inevitably prove fatal, and that the body would hang long enough for irreversible damage to occur. Each of these assumptions could be challenged by someone with sufficient knowledge, resources, and determination. Arena executions faced similar challenges. Lions and other predators were unpredictable. They might kill quickly and cleanly, or they might maim without delivering fatal wounds. Gladiatorial combat, even when rigged against the condemned, depended on human performers who might choose mercy over brutality. Even seemingly straightforward executions like beheading required precise technique and steady nerves that not every executioner possessed. The underground survival networks that developed in response to these vulnerabilities represented one of history's most remarkable examples of organized resistance. These weren't random acts of individual heroism, but sophisticated operations that required extensive planning, detailed anatomical knowledge, reliable funding, and absolute secrecy. They developed their own hierarchies, their own training programs, their own codes of conduct that governed when and how to attempt rescues. At the heart of these networks were the Medici Mortis, literally doctors of death, physicians who specialized in the narrow margin between life and apparent death. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, studied the human body's capacity for survival under extreme duress. They learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished genuine death from recoverable unconsciousness. They developed techniques for slowing heartbeat and breathing that could fool even experienced executioners. Most crucially, they understood exactly how long the human body could endure various forms of trauma before suffering irreversible damage. The Medici Mortis operated under constant threat of discovery and execution themselves. Roman law made no distinction between attempting to save a condemned criminal and committing treason against the state. Yet they persisted, driven by a combination of medical curiosity, humanitarian impulse, and often substantial financial incentives. The families of condemned prisoners would pay enormous sums for even the slightest chance of survival, creating a black market in life itself. These physicians didn't work alone. Around them developed entire support networks of sympathetic guards, corrupt officials, skilled craftsmen who could forge documents, and safe house operators who could hide survivors while they recovered and assumed new identities. The scope of these operations was remarkable. They extended from the highest levels of Roman society down to slaves and gladiators, crossing religious, ethnic, and class boundaries that were otherwise rigidly maintained. The survival networks also developed their own intelligence systems. They needed to know in advance who was condemned, when and where executions would take place, which officials might be bribed, and which methods would be used. This required extensive spy networks within the Roman legal system itself, reaching into prisons, courts, and even the imperial palace. Perhaps most remarkably, these networks maintained detailed records of their operations. They tracked success rates for different survival techniques, compiled biographical information on corrupt officials, and maintained careful financial accounts of bribes paid and services rendered. Some of these records have survived in fragmentary form, hidden in Christian catacombs or preserved in private family archives, giving us unprecedented insight into how organized resistance operated within the Roman system. The existence of these survival networks forced Roman authorities into an escalating cycle of countermeasures. As escape techniques became more sophisticated, execution methods became more elaborate and foolproof. This created what we might call an evolutionary arms race, with each side developing increasingly complex strategies to outwit the other. Understanding this historical context is crucial to appreciating the survival stories we're about to explore. These weren't miraculous interventions or random strokes of luck. They were the products of careful planning, extensive knowledge, considerable resources, and extraordinary courage. They represent humanity's refusal to accept that any system of oppression, no matter how powerful or efficient, could completely extinguish the basic human drive to survive and resist. Tonight we'll see how this underground war between life and death played out in the specific stories of individuals who found themselves caught between Rome's machinery of execution and the hidden networks determined to save them. Our journey through Rome's shadow world of survival will unfold across three distinct but interconnected realms of human endurance. First, we'll descend into the amphitheaters and execution grounds where individual cunning and atomical knowledge and split-second timing meant the difference between genuine death and theatrical demise. Here we'll discover how condemned prisoners learned to manipulate their own physiology, how they read the subtle signs that distinguished a survivable wound from a fatal one, and how they exploited the Roman obsession with spectacle to create opportunities for escape. We'll explore the extraordinary case of Gaius Valerius Maximus, a former legionnaire who survived crucifixion by understanding the precise mechanics of how the human body fails on the cross. His survival wasn't luck. It was applied knowledge of circulation, breathing, and blood loss that he'd gained from years of battlefield medicine. We'll see how he prepared his body in the days before his execution, how he positioned himself during the crucifixion process, and how he manipulated the timing of his apparent death to coincide with the changing of the guard shifts. Then we'll meet Claudia Severa, a Gaulish priestess who survived being thrown to the lions in the Flavian amphitheater through an intricate understanding of animal behavior that she'd developed during years of ritual sacrifice. Her survival depended not on overpowering the beasts, but on reading their moods, understanding their feeding patterns, and knowing exactly how to position her body to sustain mauling without fatal damage to vital organs. From there we'll ascend into the corridors of power where corruption and political maneuvering created elaborate theatrical productions disguised as executions. This was the realm of the wealthy and politically connected, where death sentences became negotiated performances with predetermined outcomes. Here survival wasn't about individual resilience, but about social networks, financial resources, and the careful choreography of public deception. We'll uncover the remarkable story of Senator Lucius Cornelius Tacitus, not the famous historian but his lesser-known cousin who was condemned for treason during the reign of Domitian. His execution involved an elaborate conspiracy that included bribed executioners, planted physicians in the crowd, and a prearranged funeral procession that served as cover for his escape from Rome entirely. We'll see how his survival required the coordination of dozens of conspirators across multiple social classes, each playing a carefully rehearsed role in what amounted to the ancient world's most sophisticated witness protection program. Finally, we'll journey into the spiritual underground, where religious communities transformed survival from individual acts of desperation into systematic resistance movements. This was where the Medici Mortis developed their most advanced techniques, where survival networks reached their highest level of organization, and where the line between human ingenuity and divine intervention became deliberately blurred. Here we'll encounter the extraordinary physician Demetrius of Alexandria, whose Christian community developed what may have been history's first organized trauma surgery unit. Operating from hidden chambers beneath Roman bathhouses, Demetrius and his team perfected techniques for reviving crucifixion victims, treating arena wounds, and even reversing the effects of certain poisons used in judicial executions. Their success rate was so remarkable that Roman authorities began to suspect supernatural intervention, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to create truly foolproof execution methods. We'll also explore the case of the Cilician Christians who were condemned to mass crucifixion in 247 CE. What appeared to be a devastating persecution was actually an intricately planned operation that saved more than 60% of the condemned through a combination of medical intervention, staged deaths, and coordinated rescues. Their survival network was so effective that within a decade, many of the supposedly martyred Christians were living openly under assumed identities in distant provinces, their deaths having become foundation myths for Christian communities across the empire. Each of these stories reveals different aspects of survival under Roman persecution. Some depended on individual knowledge and preparation, understanding exactly how much blood loss the human body could sustain, knowing which positions minimized damage during crucifixion, recognizing the signs of reversible versus irreversible trauma. Others required extensive social coordination, networks of sympathetic officials, corrupt guards, skilled physicians, and safe house operators who could spirit survivors away while they recovered. But all of them share certain common elements that distinguished successful survival attempts from failed ones. First, they required advanced planning. Random acts of desperation rarely succeeded. Survival demanded careful preparation, detailed intelligence, and precise timing. Second, they depended on exploiting specific vulnerabilities in Roman execution methods, understanding that crucifixion could be survived if rescue came within a narrow time window, recognizing that arena animals could be manipulated through drugs or behavioral conditioning, knowing which officials were susceptible to bribery or emotional appeals. Most importantly, they all required what we might call collaborative heroism. Individual courage was essential, but it was never sufficient. Every successful survival story involved multiple people risking their own lives to save someone else, creating webs of mutual dependence that crossed social, religious, and ethnic boundaries that Roman society otherwise kept rigidly separate. As we explore these stories, we'll discover that they weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of resistance that fundamentally challenged Roman assumptions about power, death, and social control. The survival networks that developed around Roman executions represented one of history's most sophisticated underground movements, combining medical knowledge, political intelligence, financial resources, and spiritual commitment in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the resistance movements of the 20th century. Tonight, we'll see how ordinary people, slaves, soldiers, merchants, priests, and criminals created extraordinary systems for preserving life in the face of state-sponsored death. We'll discover that the boundary between life and death wasn't as absolute as Roman authorities pretended, and that human ingenuity, compassion, and determination could triumph even in the empire's darkest moments. These aren't just historical curiosities or ancient medical case studies. They're stories about the fundamental human refusal to accept that any authority, no matter how powerful, has the final word over life and death. They remind us that even in humanity's most brutal chapters, people found ways to choose hope over despair, cooperation over submission, and life over the seemingly inevitable victory of death. The morning sun cast long shadows across the execution ground outside Rome's walls when Gaius Valerius Maximus was dragged from his cell in chains. To the jeering crowd gathering for the day's entertainment, he appeared to be just another condemned criminal, perhaps a deserter, maybe a rebel, certainly someone who had defied the empire's authority and would now pay the ultimate price. What they couldn't see were the subtle preparations he had made in the 3 days since his death sentence, preparations that would transform his crucifixion from an ending into an elaborate performance of survival. Maximus was no ordinary condemned man. A former legionnaire with 20 years of service along the Germanic frontier, he had seen more battlefield trauma than most military surgeons. He had watched men die from wounds that should have been survivable, and more remarkably, he had seen others live through injuries that should have killed them instantly. During the long winter campaigns along the Rhine, when medical supplies ran low and field physicians were days away, soldiers learned to become their own doctors. They developed an intimate understanding of the human body's capacity for damage, its ability to compensate for lost blood, and most crucially, the narrow margin between recoverable unconsciousness and irreversible death. When Maximus was arrested for allegedly selling military equipment to Germanic tribes, a charge he may or may not have been guilty of, but one that carried an automatic death sentence, he didn't despair. Instead, he began to calculate. He had perhaps a week before his execution, maybe 10 days if the courts were backlogged. That gave him time to prepare his body for an ordeal that killed most men within 6 to 12 hours, but which he believed he could survive if he could control the variables. The first variable was blood loss. Crucifixion nails, when properly placed, caused significant bleeding but typically missed major arteries. The key was positioning. During his final days in prison, Maximus exercised his wrists and ankles obsessively, building up muscle mass around the areas where the nails would penetrate. Thicker muscle tissue would provide more resistance to the iron spikes, potentially deflecting them away from critical blood vessels. He also began a regimen of controlled blood loss, using a sharp stone to make small cuts on his arms and legs. This wasn't self-harm, it was training. By gradually reducing his blood volume over several days, he was conditioning his body to function with less blood, extending the time he could survive massive hemorrhaging. The second variable was breathing. Death on the cross typically came from asphyxiation as the victim's diaphragm became paralyzed by exhaustion and pain. But Maximus had observed something during his military service. Men who had been trained in certain breathing techniques could remain conscious longer under extreme physical stress. He spent his final nights practicing what we might now call meditation breathing, slow, deep respirations that maximized oxygen intake while minimizing the energy required to maintain consciousness. The third and most crucial variable was timing. Crucifixion victims were typically left hanging until they were obviously dead, sometimes for days. But Maximus had noticed that executions followed predictable patterns. Guards changed shifts every 8 hours. Crowds dispersed around midday when the sun became unbearable. Officials rarely stayed to supervise the entire process, preferring to return to their comfortable offices once the spectacle began. If he could time his apparent death to coincide with these natural lulls in supervision, he might create a window for rescue. But Maximus couldn't execute his survival plan alone. In the underground networks that connected prisoners, gladiators and sympathetic citizens, word spread that the old soldier had a chance if he could get help. The Medici Mortis took notice. Here was a man with genuine medical knowledge, someone who understood his own physiology well enough to possibly survive what killed almost everyone else. More importantly, he was a Roman citizen, a veteran with no family to mourn him publicly, but enough former comrades to fund a rescue operation. The network that formed around Maximus's survival attempt was remarkably sophisticated. It included Marcus Trebius, a retired centurion who had served under Maximus in Germania, and who had become wealthy trading in Germanic amber. Trebius provided the financial resources, bribing guards to ensure they would be distracted at crucial moments, and paying for the services of Lucius Scribonius, one of Rome's most skilled Medici Mortis. Trebonius was a fascinating figure in his own right. Officially, he was a physician who treated wealthy Roman families for conventional ailments. Unofficially, he had developed techniques for reviving the apparently dead that bordered on the supernatural. He understood that crucifixion killed through a combination of blood loss, dehydration, and respiratory failure, but that each of these processes could be reversed if intervention came quickly enough. He had successfully revived 7 crucifixion victims over the past 5 years, though officially those men had never existed. The plan they developed was intricate and dangerous. Maximus would endure the crucifixion process normally until late afternoon, when the sun's heat and his controlled blood loss would naturally cause him to lose consciousness. At that point, Scribonius, disguised as a curious spectator, would approach the cross to examine the condemned man. Using techniques he had learned from Egyptian embalmers, he would slow Maximus's heartbeat and breathing to barely detectable levels, creating the appearance of death that would satisfy the guard's casual inspection. Meanwhile, Trebius would be spreading rumors in nearby taverns that the old soldier had already died, encouraging the guards to cut short their supervision. Gold coins, strategically distributed, would ensure that the guards were more interested in drinking than in maintaining a vigorous death watch. When darkness fell, the rescue team would approach the cross, ostensibly to remove the body for burial, but actually to begin the delicate process of revival. The execution itself unfolded almost exactly as planned. Maximus was nailed to his cross at dawn, using every technique he had practiced to minimize damage and blood loss. He endured the morning agony by focusing on his breathing, conserving his strength for the crucial moment when he would need to appear dead. By midday, the crowd had largely dispersed, leaving only a handful of guards who were more interested in seeking shade than in watching a dying man. When Maximus finally lost consciousness in the late afternoon heat, Scribonius made his move. Approaching the cross with the confident manner of a physician, he examined the corpse and pronounced it dead. The guards, eager to complete their duties and return to the city, readily accepted his professional opinion. As far as the official records were concerned, Gaius Valerius Maximus had died at the 6th hour after his crucifixion, well within the normal range for such executions. But death in this case was a carefully choreographed performance. Within hours, Maximus was breathing again, beginning a recovery that would take months but would ultimately return him to something approaching normal life. His survival wasn't a miracle. It was the product of medical knowledge, careful planning, financial resources, and extraordinary courage. To understand how Maximus achieved the impossible, we must delve into the brutal mechanics of crucifixion itself and the precise anatomical knowledge that made survival conceivable. The Romans designed crucifixion as the perfect fusion of maximum suffering with inevitable death, but their very attention to prolonging agony created narrow windows of opportunity that could be exploited by those who understood the process intimately. The cross itself was not the simple wooden structure depicted in later religious art. Roman crucifixes were engineering marvels of calculated torture, designed with specific proportions that maximized suffering while ensuring the victim remained visible to crowds for the longest possible time. The vertical post or stipes stood roughly 8 feet high, tall enough to elevate the condemned above the crowd, but low enough that spectators could clearly see their facial expressions and hear their cries. The horizontal crossbeam or patibulum was carefully proportioned to force the victim's arms into a position that made breathing laboriously difficult but not immediately impossible. The nailing process followed a precise ritual that revealed Roman expertise in anatomy. Contrary to popular belief, the nails were not driven through the palms of the hands, which would have torn through the soft tissue and allowed the body to fall. Instead, executioners aimed for the space between the radius and ulnar bones of the forearm, just above the wrist. This area could support the full weight of a human body while causing excruciating pain as the iron spikes compressed the median nerve, the same nerve involved in modern carpal tunnel syndrome, but traumatized to a degree that sent constant waves of agony up the arms. The feet presented a more complex challenge. Some executioners used a single nail driven through both feet, pinning them against the front of the vertical post. Others preferred separate nails for each foot, angled upward through the tarsal bones to prevent the victim from pushing upward to relieve pressure on their arms. The most sadistic executioners used a small wooden platform, called a sedile, positioned just below the victim's buttocks. This wasn't mercy, it was calculated cruelty. The sedile provided just enough support to prevent immediate death from asphyxiation, prolonging the agony for days rather than hours. What killed crucifixion victims wasn't blood loss, as many assume, but a combination of exposure, dehydration, and ultimately asphyxiation. The position of the arms made normal breathing nearly impossible. To draw breath, victims had to push upward with their legs, lifting their body weight against the nails in their feet, allowing their diaphragm to expand. This created a horrific cycle: breathe and experience crushing pain in the feet and legs, or avoid the pain and slowly suffocate. Most victims alternated between these options for hours or days until exhaustion made it impossible to continue lifting themselves, at which point death came relatively quickly. But Maximus had identified several vulnerabilities in this process that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and preparation. First, the timing of death was largely dependent on the victim's physical condition before crucifixion. A healthy, well-muscled man could potentially survive much longer than the typical criminal who had been weakened by imprisonment, torture, or poor nutrition. Second, the executioner's anatomical knowledge, while substantial, was not perfect. Slight variations in nail placement could mean the difference between severed arteries and survivable puncture wounds. Most crucially, Maximus understood that the line between apparent death and actual death was much narrower than most people realized. Severe blood loss, dehydration, and exhaustion could cause a victim to lose consciousness and display all the visible signs of death. No apparent breathing, no response to stimuli, pale skin, and a barely detectable pulse, while still retaining enough brain and heart function to survive if conditions improved. During his days in prison, Maximus had systematically prepared his body for each phase of the crucifixion process. His controlled blood loss regimen wasn't just about conditioning his cardiovascular system. It was about understanding exactly how much blood he could lose while remaining conscious. Through careful experimentation, he had determined that he could lose approximately 2 pints of blood, roughly 20% of his total blood volume, and still maintain enough cognitive function to control his breathing and positioning on the cross. His breathing exercises served multiple purposes. By strengthening his diaphragm and intercostal muscles, he increased his ability to lift his body weight to draw breath. More importantly, he learned to maximize oxygen efficiency, extracting more breathable air from each labored inhalation. He also practiced slowing his heart rate through controlled breathing, a technique that would prove crucial when he needed to appear dead to the examining physician. The physical conditioning of his wrists and ankles was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of his preparation. By building muscle mass around the areas where nails would penetrate, he was essentially creating natural tourniquets that would limit blood flow and reduce the risk of severing major blood vessels. The additional muscle tissue also provided more structural support, reducing the likelihood that the iron spikes would tear through bone or cartilage. But all of this preparation would have been useless without understanding the social and administrative aspects of Roman execution. Maximus had observed that crucifixions followed predictable patterns of supervision. Initial interest was high, with crowds, officials, and guards maintaining careful watch. But as hours passed and the spectacle lost its novelty, attention inevitably waned. Guards became bored, officials returned to other duties, and crowds dispersed to seek entertainment elsewhere. The changing of the guard every 8 hours created brief periods of confusion and reduced vigilance. New guards needed time to assess the situation, count the victims, and establish their own routines. These transition periods, typically lasting 15 to 30 minutes, represented opportunities for medical intervention that would be impossible during periods of active supervision. Maximus had also noted that physicians or other medical professionals were rarely present at executions unless specifically summoned to pronounce death. This created an opportunity for the mediti mortis to approach crosses under the pretense of medical examination, particularly if they could present themselves as official representatives sent to confirm death for administrative purposes. The revival process itself required split-second timing and extraordinary medical skill. Scribonius approached Maximus's cross during the evening guard change, when natural lighting made detailed examination difficult and the new guards were still establishing their positions. Using techniques borrowed from Egyptian embalming practices, he quickly assessed Maximus's condition and determined that revival was possible. The key was stimulating circulation and breathing without creating obvious signs of life that would alert the guards. Scribonius used pressure point manipulation to restart blood flow to Maximus's extremities, combined with controlled stimulation of breathing reflexes. Within minutes, Maximus was conscious enough to participate in his own revival, though he remained motionless and apparently dead to casual observation. The reason Maximus's survival was possible lay not in divine intervention or extraordinary luck, but in a sophisticated understanding of Roman bureaucracy and human psychology that the mediti mortis had developed over decades of operation. These underground networks had studied the empire's execution system with the same methodical precision that Roman engineers brought to building aqueducts, identifying systemic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those willing to risk everything for the chance to preserve life. The fundamental weakness in Roman execution was its reliance on human judgment at every critical juncture, from the moment a death sentence was pronounced to the final disposal of the body. Dozens of individuals had to make decisions, follow procedures, and maintain vigilance. Each of these decision points represented an opportunity for error, corruption, or simple human compassion to intervene. The Medici Mortis understood that they weren't fighting against an impersonal machine of death, but against a collection of fallible human beings who could be influenced, distracted, bribed, or convinced to look the other way at crucial moments. Roman law required that executions be public and witnessed by official representatives, but it said nothing about the qualifications of those witnesses. This created opportunities for the survival networks to place their own people in positions where they could influence outcomes. A medicus mortis presenting himself as a physician sent to confirm death would rarely be questioned, particularly if he carried the appropriate documents and spoke with authority about medical matters that ordinary guards didn't understand. The networks had also identified patterns in Roman administrative procedure that could be exploited. Death certificates, for example, were typically prepared in advance and simply required confirmation that the execution had been completed. Guards were more interested in completing their paperwork than in conducting thorough medical examinations. A physician who could convincingly pronounce death and sign the appropriate documents was providing a valuable service that made everyone's job easier. More importantly, the survival networks understood the economics of Roman execution. Guards, executioners, and minor officials were typically poorly paid men who viewed their positions as opportunities for supplemental income. The families of condemned prisoners were often willing to pay substantial sums for even the slightest chance of survival, creating a black market in mercy that operated parallel to the official system of justice. The Medici Mortis served as intermediaries in this market, connecting desperate families with corruptible officials while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect everyone involved. The medical knowledge that underpinned these operations was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The Medici Mortis had developed techniques for inducing states of apparent death that were centuries ahead of their contemporaries. They understood that certain combinations of blood loss, dehydration, and physical trauma could cause the human body to shut down non-essential functions while maintaining just enough brain and heart activity to permit revival. They had experimented with various drugs and poisons that could slow heart rate and breathing to nearly undetectable levels, creating the appearance of death that would satisfy casual examination. Perhaps most remarkably, they had developed detailed protocols for different types of execution. Crucifixion survival required different techniques than arena survival, which differed from the methods used to survive poisoning or burning. Each execution method had its own optimal timing for intervention, its own set of bribable officials, and its own medical challenges for revival. The networks maintained careful records of success rates, identifying which techniques worked best under which circumstances, and continuously refining their methods based on experience. The organizational structure of these networks was necessarily complex and secretive. At the top were the Master Medici Mortis, physicians with years of experience and extensive knowledge of human anatomy and physiology. Below them were assistant physicians, often young men being trained in the techniques of revival and apparent death. The networks also included specialists in other areas, document forgers who could create convincing official papers, intelligence gatherers who monitored court proceedings and prison conditions, financial intermediaries who handled bribes and payments, and safe house operators who could hide survivors during their recovery. Communication within the networks relied on elaborate codes and dead drops that allowed information to flow without compromising security. Members used false names and met in locations that couldn't be traced back to their operations. The Christian communities that harbored many of these networks provided additional cover, as their existing secretive structure and persecution by Roman authorities made them natural allies for anyone opposing the state's power over life and death. The networks also developed sophisticated methods for creating new identities for survivors. A man who had officially died on a Roman cross couldn't simply return to his previous life. He needed new documentation, a new history, and often a new location far from Rome where his survival wouldn't be recognized. The networks maintained contacts throughout the empire who could provide employment, housing, and social connections for people who had to start their lives over from nothing. The financial resources required for these operations were enormous. Beyond the direct costs of bribes and medical care, the networks had to maintain safe houses, provide for survivors during their recovery, create new identities, and fund the ongoing intelligence operations that made their work possible. Much of this money came from the families of the condemned, but the networks also received support from wealthy sympathizers who opposed Roman execution methods on philosophical or religious grounds. The Roman authorities were not unaware of these activities. Imperial records contain numerous references to suspected survival networks, and several major investigations were launched to identify and prosecute their members. However, the very secrecy that made the networks effective also made them extremely difficult to penetrate. Members knew only what they needed to know for their specific roles, and the compartmentalized structure meant that capturing one member rarely led to the discovery of others. The survival of Maximus represented the culmination of decades of development in techniques, organization, and operational security. His case demonstrated that Roman execution, for all its brutality and theatrical effectiveness, was not the perfect system of state control that the empire pretended it to be. Instead, it was a human institution, vulnerable to human weaknesses and capable of being defeated by human ingenuity, courage, and determination. Yet the very success of survival networks like the one that saved Maximus created a bitter irony that would haunt the Roman execution system for centuries. The more sophisticated these rescue operations became, the more they revealed fundamental contradictions in Roman society itself, contradictions between the empire's public commitment to justice and its private tolerance for corruption, between its rhetoric of absolute state power and its dependence on fallible human agents, and most painfully, between its claims of moral authority and its willingness to profit from human suffering. The case of Marcus Flavius Antonius illustrates this paradox perfectly. Antonius was a wealthy grain merchant who had been condemned for tax evasion, a crime that normally carried a substantial fine rather than death, but which had been elevated to a capital offense because the missing taxes had been earmarked for military supplies during a Germanic campaign. His execution was scheduled for the amphitheatre, where he would face wild boars imported specifically for the occasion. The symbolism was deliberate. A man who had stolen food from soldiers would be devoured by beasts, demonstrating the consequences of betraying Rome's military needs. But Antonius had resources that most condemned criminals lacked. His business dealings had made him wealthy, and more importantly, had connected him with a network of merchants, officials, and aristocrats who depended on his services. When word of his death sentence spread through Rome's commercial district, an extraordinary coalition formed to secure his survival. This wasn't charity or religious conviction driving the rescue effort. It was pure economic self-interest. Too many powerful people owed Antonius money or depended on his trade relationships to allow him to simply disappear into the arena's sand. The survival plan that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and corruption. Rather than attempting to revive Antonius after apparent death, his rescuers decided to prevent genuine injury entirely. They bribed the bestiori, the animal handlers who managed the arena's wild beasts, to drug the boars with a mixture of wine and poppy extract that would make them sluggish and disoriented. They paid the arena physicians to have revival equipment positioned strategically around the fighting floor. Most remarkably, they convinced the magistrate overseeing the execution to allow Antonius to wear light armor, ostensibly to prolong the spectacle by giving him a fighting chance, but actually to protect him from serious injury. The execution itself became a carefully choreographed performance that satisfied the crowd's bloodlust while ensuring the condemned man's survival. The drugged boars moved slowly and predictably, allowing Antonius to avoid their charges while sustaining impressive-looking but superficial wounds. When he finally collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, the arena physicians rushed in to confirm his death, while actually beginning immediate medical treatment. The crowd, satisfied that justice had been served, dispersed without realizing they had witnessed an elaborate deception. What made this case particularly revealing was how many Roman officials participated in the deception while maintaining complete deniability. The magistrate could claim he had simply wanted to make the execution more entertaining. The animal handlers could argue they had been following standard procedures for managing dangerous beasts. The physicians could insist they had been performing their normal duties. Everyone involved had plausible explanations for their actions that didn't acknowledge the coordinated effort to save Antonius's life. This pattern of organized corruption masquerading as normal procedure became increasingly common as survival networks grew more sophisticated. Roman officials discovered that they could profit enormously from participating in rescue operations while facing minimal risk of prosecution. The key was maintaining the appearance of proper procedure while creating opportunities for things to go wrong in ways that favored survival. The economic incentives were staggering. A successful rescue operation might cost the condemned prisoner's family between 10,000 and 50,000 denarii, roughly equivalent to a decade's wages for a skilled craftsman. Of this sum, perhaps half went to direct bribes for guards, executioners, and officials. The remainder funded medical care, safe houses, new identities, and the complex logistics of making a person disappear from official records while establishing them in a new life elsewhere in the empire. For comparison, a typical Roman soldier earned approximately 300 denarii per year. A successful medicus mortis might earn more from a single rescue operation than a legionnaire made in a decade of military service. The financial rewards attracted some of the empire's most skilled physicians, who found that the technical challenges of revival medicine were far more intellectually stimulating than treating wealthy Romans for routine ailments. But the survival networks also attracted participants motivated by factors beyond money. Some were driven by religious conviction, particularly Christians who saw rescue operations as expressions of divine mercy. Others were motivated by political opposition to imperial authority, viewing each successful survival as a small victory against state oppression. Still others participated out of simple humanitarian impulses, unable to stand by while fellow human beings suffered and died for crimes that often seemed to warrant lesser punishments. The Roman authorities found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. They couldn't acknowledge the existence of survival networks without admitting that their execution system was fundamentally flawed. They couldn't crack down too harshly on suspected participants without alienating the very officials and physicians they depended on to carry out executions. Most importantly, they couldn't eliminate the economic incentives that drove the networks without fundamentally restructuring their entire legal and administrative system. Instead, they chose to escalate the brutality and complexity of execution methods, hoping to create procedures that were genuinely impossible to survive or subvert. This led to innovations like the breaking wheel, where victims' bones were systematically shattered to prevent any possibility of revival, and more elaborate crucifixion techniques designed to ensure rapid and irreversible death. But each new method simply challenged the survival networks to develop new techniques, creating an arms race between executioners and rescuers that would continue for centuries. While the networks perfected their methods for surviving crucifixion and political executions, the arena presented entirely different challenges that required a completely different set of skills. Here, survival depended not on understanding human physiology or corrupting Roman officials, but on reading the minds of wild beasts and manipulating their behavior in ways that turned certain death into elaborate theater. The most remarkable practitioner of this deadly art was a woman whose very existence challenged every assumption Romans held about gender, courage, and the natural order. Claudia Severa had been born into the Gaulish nobility, daughter of a chieftain who controlled valuable iron mines in what is now modern France. But her privileged upbringing ended abruptly when her father's tribe rebelled against Roman taxation policies. The rebellion was crushed with typical Roman efficiency, and Severa found herself condemned to the arena as part of the victory celebrations that followed. At 19 years old, she faced the prospect of being torn apart by wild animals for the entertainment of Roman crowds who viewed her as little more than an exotic curiosity. What the Romans didn't know was that Severa possessed knowledge that made her perhaps uniquely qualified to survive an arena encounter. As the daughter of a Gaulish chieftain, she had been trained from childhood in the sacred mysteries of her people, which included extensive knowledge of animal behavior and psychology. Gaulish priests performed elaborate animal sacrifices that required precise understanding of how different species reacted to stress, fear, and human presence. More importantly, they had developed techniques for calming and controlling wild animals that were far more sophisticated than anything known to Roman beast handlers. During her months in prison awaiting execution, Severa systematically gathered intelligence about the Flavian amphitheater's operations. She cultivated relationships with gladiators, beast handlers, and even some of the condemned criminals who had survived previous arena encounters. From them she learned the specific animals she would likely face, their feeding schedules, their behavioral patterns, and most crucially the various drugs and treatments used to make them more or less aggressive depending on the type of spectacle desired. The survival network that formed around Severa was unlike any other in Roman history. Instead of relying primarily on bribed officials or corrupt physicians, her rescue operation centered on manipulating the animals themselves. Working through sympathetic beast handlers who had been recruited by Christian missionaries, she arranged for specific modifications to be made to the lions and leopards she would face. The key was understanding that arena animals were not the savage, uncontrollable beasts that Roman propaganda portrayed. They were valuable investments that required careful management to provide the right type of entertainment. Animals that killed too quickly or too efficiently were actually counterproductive, as they ended the spectacle before crowds could fully enjoy the condemned prisoners' suffering. The most valuable arena beasts were those that would wound and terrify their victims while prolonging the encounter for maximum dramatic effect. Severa's plan exploited this preference for theatrical rather than purely lethal encounters. 3 days before her execution, the lions designated for her encounter were given meat treated with a carefully calculated mixture of wine and medicinal herbs. This wasn't enough to seriously impair the animals, but it subtly altered their behavior in ways that would prove crucial during the actual encounter. The drugged meat made the lions slightly less aggressive and more predictable in their movements, while also reducing their usual wariness of human scent and behavior. More importantly, Severa had learned techniques from her Gaulish training that allowed her to influence animal behavior through posture, movement, and even scent. She spent her final days in prison practicing specific breathing exercises that would minimize the fear scent that typically triggered predatory responses in big cats. She learned to move in ways that would appear dramatic and desperate to human observers while actually signaling submission and non-threat to the animals. The execution itself unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between human intelligence and animal instinct. When Severa was led into the arena, she appeared to stumble and fall, a display of weakness that satisfied the crowd's expectation while actually positioning her in a way that made her seem less threatening to the approaching lions. As the great cat circled her, she used subtle hand gestures and body positioning that she had learned from Gaulish animal handling traditions to guide their movements and discourage aggressive behavior. The encounter that followed looked to the crowd like a dramatic life and death struggle, but was actually a complex negotiation between human and animal psychology. The lions, influenced by their drugged meat and responding to Severa's careful behavioral cues, inflicted impressive-looking wounds that satisfied the crowd's bloodlust while avoiding damage to vital organs. When she finally collapsed, apparently overwhelmed by her injuries, she had actually positioned herself in a way that protected her most vulnerable areas while creating dramatic visual effects that convinced spectators she had been mortally wounded. The arena physicians who examined her corpse were part of the survival network, trained to recognize the difference between genuine life-threatening injuries and the carefully controlled wounds that Severa had sustained. Working quickly, while the crowd's attention was focused on other spectacles, they transported her to a hidden medical facility beneath the amphitheater, where she began a recovery process that would take months but would ultimately restore her to health. What made Severa's survival extraordinary wasn't just her individual courage and knowledge, but the way it demonstrated the incredible sophistication of survival networks that could coordinate human intelligence, animal psychology, medical expertise, and institutional corruption into a seamless operation. Her case showed that even the most seemingly impossible survival scenarios could be overcome by people with sufficient knowledge, resources, and determination. The Roman authorities never discovered the full extent of Severa's deception. Official records show that a Gaulish woman named Claudia Severa died in the arena, mauled by lions, her body disposed of according to standard procedures. What they didn't record was that within 2 years, a woman matching her description had established herself as a successful merchant in Alexandria, using knowledge of animal behavior gained in Gaulish training to become one of the empire's most successful traders in exotic animals, including, ironically, the very species of big cats that had supposedly killed her in Rome's greatest amphitheater. But perhaps the most audacious survival story of the imperial period involved not a common criminal or foreign captive, but a man at the very heart of Roman power itself. Senator Lucius Cornelius Tacitus, sharing a name but not bloodline with the famous historian, represented everything the empire claimed to stand for: patrician birth, military distinction, political acumen, and unwavering loyalty to Roman values. Yet when the paranoid Emperor Domitian decided that Tacitus posed a threat to imperial authority, the senator's very proximity to power became his greatest liability and, paradoxically, his ultimate salvation. Tacitus had made the fatal error of expressing moderate criticism of imperial policies during a private dinner party. In the toxic atmosphere of Domitian's court, where suspected treason lurked behind every conversation and informants competed to report seditious whispers, even the most cautious political commentary could be construed as rebellion. When word of his remarks reached the emperor through the elaborate network of spies and flatterers that surrounded the imperial palace, Tacitus found himself facing charges that would inevitably result in a death sentence. But unlike common criminals or foreign prisoners, Tacitus possessed resources and connections that made traditional survival methods inadequate. He couldn't simply disappear into an underground medical network or rely on corrupt guards to look the other way. His execution would be a major political event, attended by senators, imperial officials, and members of the aristocratic families who formed the backbone of Roman society. Any attempt at obvious deception would be immediately detected by observers who understood both the political stakes and the medical realities of execution. Instead, Tacitus and his allies conceived a plan so elaborate and psychologically sophisticated that it amounted to a form of political theatre that would have impressed the greatest dramatists of the age. Rather than trying to avoid death, they decided to orchestrate his execution in such a way that his apparent demise would actually facilitate his escape from Rome and the creation of an entirely new identity in a distant province. The key insight was understanding that high-profile political executions were as much about ceremony and symbolism as they were about actually ending someone's life. The emperor needed Tacitus to die publicly and dramatically, but he also needed the execution to reinforce imperial authority without creating a martyr who might inspire future opposition. This created opportunities for manipulation that didn't exist in ordinary criminal cases. Working through intermediaries who could maintain plausible deniability, Tacitus's supporters began laying groundwork for his survival months before the actual execution. They arranged for a physician with extensive experience in apparent death techniques to be appointed as the official medical examiner for political executions. They placed sympathetic senators in positions where they could influence the timing and location of the execution ceremony. Most crucially, they began spreading carefully crafted rumors about Tacitus's health, suggesting that he was suffering from a wasting disease that might make his execution anticlimactic. The execution method chosen for Tacitus was forced suicide, a privilege extended to senators that allowed them to die with some dignity, while still satisfying the emperor's need for their elimination. This created perfect conditions for the survival plan, as it meant that Tacitus would have some control over the timing and circumstances of his apparent death, while also providing cover for the medical intervention that would actually save his life. The poison selected for Tacitus's suicide was hemlock, chosen both for its symbolic associations with philosophical martyrdom and for its specific physiological effects. Hemlock killed by causing progressive paralysis that began in the extremities and gradually spread to vital organs, but the process could take several hours and could be reversed if intervention came quickly enough. More importantly, the symptoms of hemlock poisoning, numbness, difficulty breathing, and eventual unconsciousness could be mimicked by other substances that were not actually lethal. What Tacitus consumed during his execution ceremony was not pure hemlock, but a carefully prepared mixture that included enough genuine poison to produce convincing symptoms while substituting other compounds that would create temporary paralysis without causing permanent damage. The preparation of this mixture required extraordinary skill and represented one of the most sophisticated applications of pharmacological knowledge in the ancient world. The execution ceremony itself unfolded with the dignity and solemnity appropriate to a senator's death. Tacitus delivered a final speech that struck the perfect balance between accepting responsibility for his actions and subtly criticizing the political climate that had made his death necessary. He consumed the prepared poison with apparent resignation, displaying the stoic courage that Romans expected from members of their ruling class. As the poison took effect, Tacitus exhibited all the symptoms that observers expected to see: progressive numbness, difficulty speaking, labored breathing, and eventually apparent death. The attending physician, who was secretly part of the survival network, confirmed his death with a thorough examination that satisfied the watching senators, while actually assessing whether revival would be possible. The funeral arrangements that followed were elaborate and public, befitting a senator's status, but they also provided cover for the final phase of the survival operation. The body was transported to a family mausoleum outside Rome, where burial preparations supposedly began immediately to prevent the political embarrassment of decomposition. In reality, these preparations involved intensive medical intervention designed to counteract the effects of the modified poison and restore Tacitus to consciousness. Within days of his official death, Tacitus was conscious and beginning recovery, though he remained hidden in secure locations while plans were finalized for his new identity. The network had prepared documentation establishing him as a wealthy merchant from Syria, complete with business connections and property holdings that would allow him to live comfortably while remaining far from Roman political circles. The ultimate irony of Tacitus's survival was that his apparent death actually enhanced his political influence rather than ending it. Free from the constraints of senatorial dignity and imperial suspicion, he was able to use his merchant identity to develop intelligence networks and financial connections that proved far more effective than anything he had accomplished as an official member of the Roman ruling class. As survival stories like those of Maximus, Severa, and Tacitus became whispered legends throughout the empire, Roman authorities found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge to their fundamental assumptions about power, death, and social control. The very existence of these underground networks represented more than mere criminal activity. They constituted a systematic assault on the empire's monopoly over life and death that threatened to undermine the psychological foundations of Roman rule itself. The imperial response evolved through several distinct phases, each representing increasingly desperate attempts to close the vulnerabilities that survival networks had learned to exploit. Initially, Roman officials simply refused to acknowledge that the networks existed, treating successful survivals as isolated incidents of corruption or incompetence that could be addressed through better supervision and harsher penalties for officials who failed to ensure proper execution procedures. This denial became impossible to maintain as evidence mounted that survival operations were not random occurrences, but systematic activities involving hundreds of participants across all levels of Roman society. Imperial investigators began uncovering medical equipment hidden in execution sites, coded communications between supposed strangers, and financial transactions that suggested coordination between diverse groups that had no obvious reasons for cooperation. The first systematic countermeasures focused on administrative reforms designed to eliminate human error and corruption from execution procedures. New regulations required multiple medical examinations of executed criminals, with physicians held personally responsible for any mistakes in death certification. Guard rotations were randomized to prevent the development of personal relationships that might compromise security. Execution sites were redesigned to eliminate hiding places where rescue equipment might be concealed. These administrative solutions proved inadequate because they failed to address the fundamental problem. Execution systems designed by humans would always be vulnerable to human manipulation. Every new procedure created new opportunities for subversion by people who understood the system better than those who designed it. Randomized guard rotations, for example, simply meant that survival networks had to develop more sophisticated methods for identifying and influencing the personnel who would be present at any given execution. The second phase of imperial countermeasures involved technological innovations in execution methods themselves. Engineers and physicians were commissioned to develop new techniques that would be genuinely impossible to survive, regardless of medical intervention or official corruption. This led to the creation of increasingly elaborate and horrific execution devices that represented the marriage of Roman engineering skill with systematized cruelty. The improved crucifixion methods developed during this period were marvels of calculated brutality. New cross designs included mechanisms that made controlled positioning impossible, eliminating the opportunities for favorable nail placement that had enabled survivals like that of Maximus. Timing devices were incorporated that would automatically inflict additional wounds after predetermined periods, ensuring that even apparently dead victims would sustain fatal injuries if rescue attempts were made. Arena modifications were equally sophisticated. New animal handling techniques were developed that made it impossible to predict or control the behavior of execution beasts. Drugging procedures became standardized and supervised by imperial officials to prevent the kind of manipulation that had enabled Severa's survival. The arena floor itself was redesigned to eliminate hiding places and reduce opportunities for medical intervention during apparent death examinations. Perhaps most sinister were the innovations in poisoning and forced suicide procedures. Imperial physicians developed new toxins that killed more rapidly and reliably than traditional substances, while also creating compounds that could detect the presence of antidotes or neutralizing agents in the victim's system. The ceremonial aspects of senatorial suicide were modified to include multiple verification procedures that would make deceptions like Tacitus's escape impossible to repeat. But the most revealing aspect of these technological countermeasures was how they demonstrated the extent to which survival networks had succeeded in terrorizing the imperial establishment. The elaborate nature of the anti-survival devices revealed just how sophisticated and successful the rescue operations had become. The Empire was essentially admitting that its traditional execution methods were inadequate to ensure death, and that extraordinary measures were required to defeat the ingenuity of its own subjects. The third phase of imperial response involved direct attacks on the survival networks themselves. This required the development of counterintelligence operations that were unprecedented in their scope and sophistication. Imperial agents infiltrated Christian communities, medical schools, and even senatorial households in attempts to identify network members and disrupt their operations. These intelligence efforts revealed the staggering complexity of the survival networks and the degree to which they had penetrated Roman society. Investigators discovered that Mediti Mortis were operating training schools for revival techniques, that document forgers were producing identification papers of such quality that they fooled imperial bureaucrats, and that safe house networks extended from Britain to Egypt, allowing survivors to disappear completely from their former lives. The counterintelligence operations also revealed something else that deeply disturbed Roman authorities. Many of the survival network participants were not criminals, rebels, or members of despised religious minorities, but respected members of Roman society who had become convinced that the imperial execution system was morally indefensible. Physicians, merchants, retired military officers, and even some senators were actively participating in operations to save condemned prisoners. This discovery forced imperial authorities to confront an uncomfortable truth. The survival networks represented not just criminal conspiracy but genuine popular resistance to Roman methods of social control. The Empire was not just fighting against a few rogue operators but against a significant portion of its own population that had rejected the fundamental premise that the state had unlimited authority over human life. The realization that opposition to Roman execution methods had become a mass movement led to the fourth and final phase of imperial countermeasures: systematic persecution of anyone suspected of involvement in survival operations. This campaign of repression was more brutal and extensive than even the famous persecutions of Christians because it targeted the very people the empire depended on to function: physicians, administrators, military officers, and merchants. The results were paradoxical and ultimately self-defeating. The more harshly Rome cracked down on survival networks, the more sympathy these networks gained among ordinary citizens who began to see them as heroes rather than criminals. The culmination of Roman survival network sophistication came during the Great Persecution of 249 to 251 CE, when Emperor Decius launched the most systematic campaign against Christianity in the empire's history. What Roman authorities didn't anticipate was that Christian communities had spent decades perfecting survival techniques that would transform what was intended to be their final destruction into their most spectacular demonstration of organized resistance to imperial authority. The man who orchestrated this remarkable operation was Demetrius of Alexandria, a physician whose official practice treating wealthy Roman families concealed his role as the most skilled medicus mortis in the Eastern Empire. Demetrius had been born into a Christian family in Alexandria, where the intellectual traditions of the ancient world's greatest library combined with the practical medical knowledge of Egyptian embalmers to create an environment uniquely suited for developing advanced revival techniques. Unlike the individual survival operations we've explored, Demetrius was planning for mass casualties on an unprecedented scale. Imperial edicts had made it clear that Christian persecution would be systematic and empire-wide, targeting not just individual believers but entire communities. Traditional survival methods that worked for single prisoners would be completely inadequate for saving hundreds or thousands of condemned Christians simultaneously. The solution that Demetrius and his network developed was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Rather than attempting to rescue Christians after their executions, they decided to create an entire parallel infrastructure that would allow mass fake deaths followed by systematic resurrection and relocation. This required nothing less than the creation of a shadow medical system that could operate throughout the empire while remaining completely invisible to Roman authorities. The first challenge was training. The network needed dozens of skilled medica mortis who could perform revival operations under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Demetrius established what amounted to underground medical schools hidden in Christian communities across the empire. These institutions taught not just traditional healing arts but specialized techniques for inducing apparent death, recognizing recoverable unconsciousness, and performing rapid revival procedures under extreme time pressure. The curriculum was extraordinary. Students learned to identify the precise physiological signs that distinguish genuine death from recoverable unconsciousness. They studied the effects of various drugs and poisons that could create death-like states while preserving enough brain and heart function to permit revival. Most importantly, they learned to work in teams, coordinating complex medical procedures under conditions where discovery would mean their own immediate execution. The second challenge was logistics. Mass survival operations required vast quantities of medical supplies, drugs, and equipment that had to be acquired and distributed without arousing suspicion. The network solved this problem by creating legitimate business enterprises that served as cover for their real activities. Christian merchants established trading companies that specialized in importing medicinal herbs and surgical instruments. Wealthy Christian families funded what appeared to be conventional medical research but actually supported the development of improved revival techniques. The third challenge was intelligence. Successful survival operations required advanced knowledge of when and where executions would take place, which officials would be present, and what methods would be used. The Christian network developed an espionage system that rivaled anything in the imperial government, with informants placed throughout the Roman administrative hierarchy who could provide early warning of planned persecutions. Perhaps most remarkably, the network developed sophisticated methods for creating new identities for survival operation participants. Christians who had officially died in Roman persecutions needed to disappear completely from their former lives and establish themselves in distant locations where their survival wouldn't be recognized. This required forged documents, false personal histories, and extensive support networks that could provide employment and social connections for people starting over with completely new identities. The scale of preparation was massive. By the time Decius launched his persecution, Christian survival networks had established hidden medical facilities in major cities throughout the empire. Underground hospitals were concealed beneath Christian churches, hidden in the basements of Christian businesses, and even built into the elaborate tunnel systems of Christian catacombs. These facilities were equipped with the most advanced medical equipment available, staffed by highly trained physicians, and supplied with drugs and materials that would be needed for mass revival operations. The persecution itself began in late 249 CE with imperial edicts requiring all citizens to perform ritual sacrifices to Roman gods, with execution as the penalty for refusal. Christians had anticipated this development and were prepared with a coordinated response that turned their persecutions into elaborate theatrical productions designed to create the appearance of martyrdom while actually preserving as many lives as possible. The key insight was understanding that Roman persecution required visible Christian deaths to be politically effective. The empire needed to demonstrate that defying imperial religious authority would result in swift and terrible punishment. But the actual death of individual Christians was less important than the public perception that Christians were being killed for their beliefs. This created opportunities for survival networks to satisfy Roman political needs while actually preserving Christian lives. If a Christian execution looked convincing to spectators and resulted in an apparently dead body that could be properly disposed of, Roman officials were satisfied regardless of whether the victim actually died or was secretly revived after the crowd dispersed. The execution methods most commonly used against Christians, crucifixion, burning, and exposure to wild animals, all created opportunities for survival networks to intervene. Crucifixion could be survived if rescue came within the narrow window between apparent death and actual death. Burning could be made survivable through fireproof clothing and controlled flame techniques. Even exposure to arena animals could be managed through careful animal handling and strategic positioning. The survival operation that unfolded during the Decian persecution was unlike anything in recorded history. Entire Christian communities participated in elaborate deceptions that transformed their executions into resurrection dramas. Christians condemned to death received intensive preparation and apparent death techniques. Medical teams positioned themselves at execution sites under various disguises. Safe houses were prepared to receive and treat survivors during their recovery periods. The results were extraordinary. Imperial records show that thousands of Christians died during the Decian persecution, their deaths properly witnessed and their bodies disposed of according to standard procedures. What the records don't show is that a significant percentage of these supposedly martyred Christians survived their executions and were living under assumed identities in distant parts of the empire within months of their official deaths. The psychological impact on both Roman authorities and Christian communities was profound. Romans began to suspect that Christian executions were not having the deterrent effect they were supposed to have, while Christians developed a sense of confidence and organization that would prove crucial in their eventual triumph over imperial persecution. What made the Christian survival operations particularly remarkable was how they revealed the interconnected nature of resistance networks that had developed throughout the Roman Empire. The success of Demetrius's mass survival program wasn't just the result of Christian organization, it was the culmination of decades of cooperation between diverse groups that had learned to work together despite fundamental differences in religion, ethnicity, and social class. By the middle of the 3rd century, survival networks had evolved into what we might recognize today as an underground railroad, with established routes, safe houses, and support systems that stretched from Britain to Egypt. These networks operated according to principles that transcended the boundaries that normally divided Roman society. A Jewish physician in Alexandria might provide medical training to a Christian medicus mortis, who would then use those skills to save a pagan philosopher condemned for political dissent. The common thread wasn't shared belief, but shared opposition to the empire's claim of absolute authority over human life. The economic infrastructure that supported these networks was staggering in its complexity and reach. Survival operations required enormous financial resources, not just for bribes and medical supplies, but for the long-term support of people who had to completely reinvent their lives after staging their own deaths. This created a shadow economy that operated parallel to legitimate Roman commerce, with its own systems of credit, investment, and resource allocation. Merchant families who had members saved by survival networks often became permanent supporters of the operations, providing funding, transportation, and cover identities for other rescued individuals. Trading companies developed elaborate schemes for moving people and resources across the empire without attracting official attention. Even slave traders, normally among the most brutal participants in Roman commerce, sometimes cooperated with survival networks when it served their interests to help certain individuals disappear from their former lives. The intelligence networks that supported survival operations were equally sophisticated. By the time of the Decian persecution, the underground possessed detailed knowledge of Roman administrative procedures, military movements, and political developments that often exceeded what was available to imperial officials themselves. This intelligence came from sources at every level of Roman society. Slaves in imperial households who overheard important conversations, clerks in government offices who copied sensitive documents, soldiers who reported on military preparations for large-scale persecutions. Perhaps most remarkably, the survival networks had developed their own systems of communication that allowed information to travel across the empire faster than official Roman messages. Using a combination of coded letters, trusted messengers, and signal systems, the networks could coordinate activities across vast distances and maintain security even when individual cells were discovered and broken up by imperial authorities. The human cost of maintaining these networks was enormous. For every successful survival operation, dozens of people risked their own lives, families, and fortunes. Network members lived under constant threat of discovery, torture, and execution. The psychological strain of maintaining false identities while participating in life and death operations took a terrible toll on everyone involved. Yet the networks not only survived but flourished, creating what amounted to an alternative society within the Roman Empire. They developed their own ethical codes, their own systems of justice, and their own methods for resolving disputes that didn't involve imperial authorities. In some ways, the survival networks represented the seeds of the post-Roman world that would emerge after the empire's collapse. Communities bound together by shared values and mutual aid, rather than by imperial law and military force. The training programs established by the networks were particularly remarkable. Medical schools hidden in Christian catacombs taught surgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream medicine for centuries. Philosophical academies disguised as merchant associations preserved and developed ideas about human rights and political resistance that would eventually contribute to the intellectual foundations of medieval and modern political thought. The networks also served as centers of technological innovation. The demands of survival operations drove advances in chemistry, pharmacology, and medical technology that far exceeded what was being developed in official Roman institutions. techniques for creating realistic wounds, inducing temporary paralysis, and reviving apparently dead patients represented cutting-edge medical science that was being practiced by underground physicians while imperial doctors were still relying on traditional methods that had changed little since Greek times. Most importantly, the survival networks created a sense of possibility that had profound psychological effects on the populations they served. The knowledge that execution wasn't necessarily final, that even the most powerful empire in history couldn't completely control life and death, gave people hope and courage that sustained them through the darkest periods of imperial oppression. The networks also served as training grounds for the leadership skills that would prove crucial in the eventual transformation of the Roman Empire. Many of the bishops, administrators, and political leaders who guided the empire's transition to Christianity had learned their organizational and strategic skills while participating in survival operations. The same abilities that made someone effective at coordinating complex rescue operations, careful planning, resource management, maintaining security while building coalitions proved invaluable in legitimate political and religious contexts. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, the survival networks had created an invisible infrastructure that was better organized, better funded, and more efficient than many official imperial institutions. This infrastructure would prove essential in Christianity's rapid expansion throughout the empire, as it provided ready-made systems for communication, resource allocation, and personnel management that could be quickly converted from supporting survival operations to supporting legitimate religious activities. The ultimate irony was that Rome's attempts to destroy Christianity through systematic persecution had actually strengthened Christian communities by forcing them to develop organizational capabilities that made them formidable competitors to imperial authority. The survival networks that emerged in response to Roman execution policies became the foundation for the alternative power structure that would eventually replace imperial rule in much of Europe. As the Roman Empire entered the crisis of the 3rd century, with barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political chaos threatening its very existence, the survival networks faced their greatest test and achieved their most spectacular triumph. The case that would become legend among the Medici Mortis involved not a mass operation like the Decian persecution, but a single individual whose survival would demonstrate the absolute pinnacle of revival medicine and underground organization. Marcus Aurelius Severinus, no relation to the famous emperor, was perhaps the most dangerous man in the Roman Empire during the reign of Emperor Aurelian. As a senator, military commander, and popular orator, Severinus had accumulated enemies across the political spectrum. Conservative senators viewed him as a dangerous populist who appealed directly to the masses. Military commanders resented his criticism of costly foreign campaigns. Most dangerously, Emperor Aurelian saw him as a potential rival whose charisma and political connections made him a threat to imperial authority. When Aurelian finally decided to eliminate Severinus in 274 CE, he chose a method of execution specifically designed to be unsurvivable. Severinus would be subjected to the complete Roman execution protocol: flogging, crucifixion, burning, and finally dismemberment, with each stage supervised by different officials to prevent any possibility of corruption or rescue. The emperor personally oversaw the planning, determined to create a spectacle so horrific and final that it would deter future opposition, while demonstrating the futility of resistance to imperial power. What Aurelian didn't know was that his plan to create an impossible execution had attracted the attention of Demetrius of Alexandria, now the undisputed master of Roman survival networks. At 73 years old, Demetrius had successfully orchestrated hundreds of rescue operations, but he had never attempted anything approaching the complexity of what would be required to save Severinus. The case would demand every technique he had developed over 5 decades of practice, plus innovations that pushed the boundaries of medical knowledge beyond anything previously attempted. The survival plan that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and complexity. Rather than attempting to prevent or minimize each form of torture, Demetrius decided to allow Severinus to endure the full execution protocol, while using advanced medical techniques to ensure that he could survive injuries that would kill anyone else. This required nothing less than temporarily transforming the human body's capacity for survival beyond normal biological limits. The preparation began months before the scheduled execution. Severinus was secretly given a series of treatments designed to maximize his body's ability to withstand trauma. His blood was gradually replaced with a modified mixture that could carry oxygen more efficiently while clotting more rapidly to prevent fatal hemorrhaging. His nervous system was conditioned with controlled applications of pain that built up tolerance to the agony he would experience. Most remarkably, his heart and lungs were strengthened through techniques borrowed from Egyptian mummification practices that could slow vital functions to barely detectable levels while maintaining enough activity to preserve life. The medical team assembled for the operation included not just mediti mortis from across the empire, but specialists in fields that barely existed as formal disciplines. There were experts in what we would now call trauma surgery, pharmaceutical chemists who had developed drugs that could control pain and bleeding, and even early anesthesiologists who understood how to manage consciousness and unconsciousness through controlled application of various substances. The execution itself was scheduled to unfold over 3 days, with each day featuring different torments designed to weaken Severinus progressively until his final death became inevitable. The first day would involve flogging and preliminary torture. The second day would feature crucifixion. The third day would conclude with burning and dismemberment of what everyone assumed would be a corpse. Day 1 proceeded exactly as planned from the imperial perspective. Severinus was flogged with the traditional Roman flagrum, a whip embedded with metal fragments that tore flesh from bone. The beating was administered by professional executioners who understood exactly how much damage the human body could sustain while remaining conscious. To observers, Severinus appeared to be suffering the expected agony and physical damage. What they couldn't see was that his modified blood was clotting almost instantly, preventing the massive blood loss that normally resulted from such beatings, while drugs administered before the execution were managing his pain responses in ways that allowed him to remain conscious and alert. The second day brought crucifixion, but not the relatively straightforward procedure that had been survived by people like Maximus. Aurelian had ordered the use of an experimental cross design that incorporated features specifically intended to prevent survival. The nails were longer and positioned to cause maximum blood loss. The cross itself included mechanisms that would automatically shift position every few hours, preventing the victim from finding any comfortable position that might preserve strength. Yet Demetrius had anticipated these innovations. The medical team had developed techniques for controlling blood flow that could minimize damage even from enhanced nail placement. More importantly, they had positioned team members throughout the crowd who could influence the execution process in subtle ways. Sympathetic guards ensured that water was provided at precisely calculated intervals to prevent fatal dehydration. Allied officials created distractions that allowed team members to approach the cross and administer medications disguised as religious rituals or crowd control measures. The most challenging aspect came on the third day, when Severinus was to be burned and dismembered. By this point he had endured 2 days of torture that would have killed most people, yet he remained alive enough to satisfy the emperor's requirements for a dramatic conclusion. The burning was intended to be the final spectacle, with dismemberment serving as confirmation that death had actually occurred. The solution that Demetrius had developed was perhaps the most sophisticated feat of survival medicine ever attempted. Using techniques borrowed from firewalking rituals and protective substances developed through years of experimentation, the team had treated Severinus's skin and clothing with compounds that would provide temporary protection from flames. More importantly, they had developed methods for inducing a death-like state so convincing that it would satisfy even close examination while preserving enough brain and heart function to permit revival. The burning itself became an elaborate theatrical production in which Severinus appeared to die in the flames while actually being protected by nearly invisible chemical barriers. The dismemberment that followed was performed on what appeared to be a corpse but was actually a body in profound suspended animation, with cuts positioned to avoid vital organs while creating convincing evidence of death. The revival process that began immediately after the crowd dispersed was the most complex medical procedure of the ancient world. It required coordinated teams of physicians working in carefully orchestrated sequence to restore circulation, breathing, and consciousness to a body that had been pushed to the absolute limits of survival. The fact that it succeeded remains one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of human ingenuity and determination. The successful revival of Marcus Aurelius Severinus marked both the greatest triumph and the effective end of the classical Roman survival networks. Word of his impossible survival spread through the empire like wildfire, creating a legend that would inspire resistance movements for centuries while simultaneously making such operations impossible to repeat. The very success of the networks had made them too visible, too dangerous, and ultimately too threatening to imperial authority to continue operating in their traditional form. What emerged from the ashes of these classical networks, however, was something far more significant than individual rescue operations. The techniques, organizational methods, and philosophical principles developed by the Medici Mortis and their allies had created an intellectual and practical foundation that would profoundly influence the development of medicine, politics, and human rights concepts for the next 1,000 years. The medical knowledge accumulated by survival networks represented one of history's most remarkable examples of practical innovation driven by humanitarian necessity. Techniques for trauma surgery, blood replacement, controlled anesthesia, and revival of apparently dead patients that were developed in secret by underground physicians were centuries ahead of mainstream medical practice. When these techniques finally entered legitimate medical discourse, they revolutionized the treatment of injuries and diseases that had previously been considered fatal. The pharmacological innovations were equally remarkable. The Medici Mortis had developed an entire catalogue of drugs and compounds that could control pain, induce temporary paralysis, slow heart rate and breathing, prevent blood clotting, and even create convincing death-like states. Many of these substances wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream medicine until the modern era, and some remain mysterious even today. The underground physicians had essentially created an alternative medical tradition that was more advanced in some areas than anything that would be seen again until the 20th century. But perhaps more importantly, the survival networks had demonstrated that systematic resistance to state power was possible, even under the most repressive conditions imaginable. The Roman Empire represented the most efficient system of social control that had ever existed. With sophisticated legal codes, professional military forces, extensive spy networks, and administrative structures that reached into every corner of the known world. Yet, ordinary people with sufficient organization, knowledge, and determination had managed to create alternative systems that could successfully challenge imperial authority over life and death. The organizational principles developed by the networks compartmentalized security, distributed leadership, financial independence, and ideological flexibility, would be rediscovered and applied by resistance movements throughout history. The same methods that allowed Christian Medici Mortis to coordinate rescue operations across the Roman Empire would later be used by everything from medieval heretical movements to modern underground railroads and resistance organizations fighting totalitarian regimes. The networks had also created new concepts of individual rights and state limitations that were revolutionary for their time. The idea that political authorities could not legitimately claim absolute power over human life, that individuals had obligations to resist unjust laws, and that communities could create alternative systems of justice and mutual aid were principles that emerged directly from the practical experience of survival network operations. These ideas found their way into early Christian theology, where they influenced developing concepts of sanctuary, martyrdom, and resistance to secular authority. They also influenced emerging legal traditions in post-Roman Europe, where the memory of successful resistance to imperial execution created precedents for limiting state power and protecting individual rights. In many ways, the survival networks represented the first systematic development of what we would now recognize as human rights principles. The educational institutions created by the networks also left lasting legacies. The underground medical schools that taught revival techniques also preserved and transmitted classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the collapse of Roman educational systems. When legitimate universities began emerging in medieval Europe, they often drew on intellectual traditions that had been preserved in survival network institutions during the dark centuries following Rome's fall. The financial innovations developed by the networks were equally significant. The need to fund complex rescue operations while maintaining absolute secrecy had led to the development of sophisticated banking and credit systems that operated across vast distances without depending on official imperial institutions. These alternative financial networks provided models for the merchant banking systems that would later finance medieval trade and exploration. Even the technological innovations driven by survival network needs had lasting impacts. The chemical compounds developed for protecting people from fire, the surgical instruments designed for rapid revival procedures, and the communication systems created for coordinating rescue operations all represented advances that were preserved and transmitted through various channels long after the networks themselves had disappeared. The philosophical legacy was perhaps most profound. The survival networks had demonstrated that the boundary between life and death was not as absolute as most people believed, that human ingenuity could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances, and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they cooperated across traditional social boundaries. These insights would influence everything from religious concepts of resurrection to scientific approaches to medical research to political theories about revolution and social change. The networks had also created a new understanding of heroism that emphasized collective action over individual achievement. The greatest survival operation successes required dozens or hundreds of people to risk everything for someone they might never meet, creating models of collaborative courage that challenged traditional Roman concepts of individual glory and personal honor. Most importantly, the survival networks had preserved hope during one of history's darkest periods. At a time when imperial power seemed absolute and resistance appeared futile, the networks had demonstrated that even the most oppressive system contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people with sufficient knowledge, organization, and determination. This lesson would prove crucial during the centuries of chaos and oppression that followed Rome's collapse, providing intellectual and practical resources for communities trying to preserve civilization and human dignity in increasingly difficult circumstances. The ultimate irony was that Rome's attempt to demonstrate the absolute nature of imperial power through spectacular executions had actually created the conditions for developing the most sophisticated resistance movement in ancient history. The survival networks that emerged in response to Roman brutality became the foundation for alternative concepts of authority, community, and human dignity that would eventually contribute to Rome's transformation and ultimate replacement by political systems that acknowledged limits to state power and recognized individual rights. Looking across the centuries from our modern perspective, the Roman survival networks seem almost impossibly distant relics of a brutal age when execution was public entertainment and medical knowledge was primitive by contemporary standards. Yet the more closely we examine these ancient resistance movements, the more we discover patterns and principles that resonate powerfully with our own struggles against oppression, injustice, and the abuse of state power. The organizational methods pioneered by the Medici Mortis, compartmentalized cells, secure communication networks, financial independence from official institutions, and the ability to operate across ethnic and religious boundaries became the template for resistance movements throughout history. The same principles that allowed Christian physicians to coordinate rescue operations across the Roman Empire would later enable the Underground Railroad to transport enslaved people to freedom in 19th century America, help Jewish communities survive the Holocaust through hidden networks of rescuers, and guide modern human rights organizations working in authoritarian states. The medical innovations developed by survival networks also have unexpected contemporary relevance. Techniques for trauma surgery developed by underground physicians treating crucifixion wounds led to advances in emergency medicine that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern battlefield medicine. The pharmacological knowledge accumulated by the Medici Mortis, particularly their understanding of how to induce death-like states while preserving essential brain and heart functions, anticipated discoveries in anesthesiology and critical care medicine that are still being refined today. Perhaps most remarkably, the ancient network's approach to creating new identities for survival operation participants established principles for witness protection and refugee assistance that remain virtually unchanged in modern practice. The same challenges faced by a crucifixion survivor who needed to disappear from Roman society and establish a new life in a distant province are essentially identical to those confronted by someone fleeing political persecution or organized crime in the contemporary world. The financial systems developed by the networks also created models that influenced the development of modern underground economies and alternative banking systems. The need to move large sums of money across vast distances while maintaining absolute secrecy led to innovations in credit, investment, and resource allocation that anticipated the development of modern international finance. Some of the same techniques used by survival networks to fund rescue operations were later employed by everything from medieval merchant associations to modern money laundering operations and terrorist financing networks. But the most profound connections between ancient survival networks and modern resistance movements lie in their shared understanding of how power actually operates and how it can be effectively challenged. The Roman networks understood that apparent state omnipotence was largely an illusion maintained through spectacular displays of violence designed to convince populations that resistance was futile. By demonstrating that even the empire's most terrifying punishments could be survived and subverted, they revealed the fundamental vulnerability of all systems based on fear and intimidation. This insight has been rediscovered by every successful resistance movement since. The same recognition that motivated Roman physicians to risk their lives saving condemned prisoners, that state power depends ultimately on popular compliance and can be undermined by organized non-cooperation, has inspired everything from Gandhi's independence movement in India to the civil rights movement in the United States to the democratic revolutions that swept Eastern Europe in 1989. The ancient networks also demonstrated the power of what we might now call soft resistance, the use of superior organization, knowledge, and moral authority to defeat systems that possessed overwhelming advantages in conventional force. The Medici Mortis couldn't match Roman military power or administrative resources, but they could operate more efficiently, more ethically, and with greater popular support than imperial institutions. This same approach has been successfully employed by modern movements challenging everything from colonial rule to totalitarian governments to corporate exploitation. Even the specific tactics developed by Roman survival networks have modern equivalents. The use of legitimate institutions as cover for resistance activities, Christian churches hiding medical facilities, merchant businesses funding rescue operations, philosophical schools preserving subversive ideas, parallels the ways that modern dissidents use universities, non-profit organizations, and international businesses to challenge authoritarian regimes. The network's emphasis on preserving and transmitting knowledge also has contemporary significance. Just as the Medici Mortis maintained libraries of medical and philosophical texts that would otherwise have been lost, modern resistance movements often serve as guardians of cultural traditions, scientific knowledge, and historical memory that authoritarian governments attempt to suppress or destroy. Perhaps most importantly, the Roman survival networks demonstrated that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they work together for humanitarian purposes. The physicians, merchants, soldiers, and slaves who participated in rescue operations weren't superhuman heroes or political revolutionaries. They were normal individuals who decided that certain principles were worth risking everything to defend. This same recognition continues to motivate contemporary resistance movements. Whether it's doctors treating patients in war zones, journalists reporting from authoritarian states, or citizens hiding refugees from persecution, the fundamental impulse remains the same: the belief that some things are more important than personal safety and that collective action can triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The legacy of Roman survival networks reminds us that resistance to oppression is not only possible but inevitable, that human ingenuity and compassion will always find ways to subvert systems based on cruelty and intimidation, and that the most powerful forces in history are often invisible networks of ordinary people united by extraordinary commitment to human dignity. As we reach the end of our journey through Rome's shadow world of survival and resistance, we're confronted with a truth that cuts to the very heart of what it means to be human. The stories we've explored of soldiers like Maximus calculating their own survival through intimate knowledge of anatomy and pain, of women like Severa transforming their execution into elaborate negotiations with wild beasts, of physicians like Demetrius creating underground medical systems that rivaled anything in the legitimate world, reveal something profound about the human spirit that transcends historical context or cultural boundaries. At its deepest level, the existence of Roman survival networks challenges one of humanity's most persistent and dangerous myths: the belief that some people are naturally victims while others are natural oppressors, that power relationships are fixed and immutable, and that ordinary individuals are powerless in the face of institutional violence and systematic cruelty. The Medici Mortis and their allies proved that this myth is false. They demonstrated that even under the most repressive conditions imaginable, when faced with the full power of history's most efficient empire, people could still choose hope over despair, cooperation over submission, and life over death. They showed that the boundary between oppressor and victim is far more permeable than either side wants to admit, and that the most seemingly powerless people can possess forms of knowledge and courage that make them formidable opponents of even the most overwhelming force. This revelation carries profound implications for how we understand human nature itself. The Roman network succeeded not because their participants were exceptional individuals with superhuman abilities, but because they were ordinary people who discovered that they possessed capabilities they never knew they had. The slave who learned to read the subtle signs of approaching death, the merchant who risked his fortune to fund rescue operations, the senator who chose exile over compliance. These were not heroes in the traditional sense, but normal human beings who found themselves capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. What enabled their transformation was not individual brilliance or moral superiority, but participation in communities that recognized and developed their hidden potential. The survival networks created environments where a former gladiator's knowledge of anatomy became invaluable medical expertise, where a barbarian prisoner's understanding of animal behavior could save lives, where a convicted criminal's experience with pain could teach others how to endure the unendurable. This suggests something remarkable about human capability, that modern society often forgets that everyone possesses forms of knowledge and strength that could prove crucial in the right circumstances, but that these abilities remain dormant unless they're recognized, valued, and developed by communities that understand their importance. The Roman networks also revealed the extent to which apparent powerlessness is often a constructed illusion maintained by those who benefit from others' submission. The empire's execution system was designed not just to kill individual dissidents, but to convince entire populations that resistance was impossible and that state power was absolute and inescapable. The spectacular nature of Roman punishments, their public character, their elaborate cruelty, their theatrical presentation, was intended to create psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Yet the survival networks proved that this psychological warfare could be defeated by people who understood how power actually operated and were willing to organize systematically to challenge it. They discovered that Rome's apparent omnipotence depended on millions of individual decisions to comply with imperial authority, and that even small groups of people who chose non-compliance could create cracks in the system that could be exploited by others. This insight has profound relevance for understanding contemporary power relationships. The same mechanisms that convinced ancient populations that Roman authority was unchangeable continue to operate in modern societies, convincing people that current arrangements are natural, inevitable, and unchangeable. The survival network's example suggests that these beliefs are often just as illusory now as they were 2,000 years ago, and that apparent powerlessness may be more of a psychological construct than a material reality. But perhaps the most important truth revealed by the Roman survival networks concerns the relationship between individual identity and collective purpose. The people who participated in rescue operations often discovered that their involvement fundamentally changed who they were and what they were capable of becoming. Physicians who had been content treating wealthy families found themselves developing revolutionary new medical techniques. Merchants who had focused solely on profit discovered they were willing to risk everything for principles they hadn't known they possessed. Soldiers who had served imperial authority without question found themselves leading resistance operations against the very system they had once defended. These transformations suggest that human identity is far more fluid and dynamic than we typically assume. The survival networks created spaces where people could discover aspects of themselves that had been suppressed or hidden by conventional social roles and expectations. They proved that the categories we use to define ourselves, citizen or foreigner, free or slave, powerful or powerless, are often artificial constructions that can be transcended when people work together for purposes larger than individual survival or advancement. The networks also demonstrated that meaning and fulfillment come not from achieving personal success within existing systems, but from participating in communities that are working to create better alternatives. The Medici Mortis who risked their lives to save condemned prisoners weren't seeking individual glory or material reward, they were finding purpose through service to something beyond themselves. This recognition that individual fulfillment emerges from collective purpose represents one of the survival network's most radical challenges to conventional thinking about human motivation and social organization. It suggests that the pursuit of individual advantage, which modern societies often treat as the natural foundation of human behavior, may actually be a learned response to artificial scarcity and competition rather than an expression of fundamental human nature. The Roman survival networks proved that when people are given opportunities to work together for humanitarian purposes, they often discover reserves of courage, creativity, and commitment that surprise even themselves. They showed that ordinary individuals, when connected to communities that recognize their worth and develop their capabilities, can achieve things that seem impossible when attempted alone. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter